Great. Well, as I'm pulling this up, thank you for me. I don't use Zoom very much for work. We like took Zoom off of our computers because our IT people think it's not secure. So I've tried to figure it out. Can you guys see my slides? Okay.
Yeah, we get
Great.
Yes,
So
we can see it.
bear with me. I'm competent in Blue Jeans, Teams, WhatsApp, and all these other stuff, but I don't use Zoom very much for work. So apologies. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Obviously, I think this is coming at a very important time. So I'm glad that Tina and I had an opportunity to figure out how to sort of both, bring along, help sort of inform you all in thinking about what the international climate agenda means for your work. I've been talking with Tina about sort of how to bring some of the work that you all have been doing, kind of the agenda setting that you've been doing to sort of inform the international side of the team that we're all fighting to try to solve this climate crisis. So so just a little bit about me, just before I dive in to sort of orient. So I've been working on the international climate agenda for too long now. I oversee a team that works on this, internationally. So I have teams in China and India, Canada, Latin America, and on the global stage trying to drive this agenda. I obviously try to work very closely with my friends in NRDC that are driving the domestic agenda, but wanted to kind of orient that I'm going to be mostly speaking about what the kind of international climate agenda kind of looks like. It's really important, as everybody knows. There's no real only international and only domestic agenda. They're often very interwoven. They do have their own tracks, but they're kind of centrally integrated into a lot of kind of pieces. So we were sort of beginning last year looking at the possibility that we'd have a new administration that was not Trump. That there was an opportunity and a need to drive a much more robust climate agenda on the international stage than even at the kind of up and running when the Obama administration was kind of running at full steam was delivered. For obviously folks know, for a lot of reasons, there's I think an even greater urgency. So since the end of the Obama administration, the 1.5 Celsius report came out, which, for those of us that are climate activists, we kind of always knew those numbers, but that obviously galvanized that we needed to be even faster in driving climate action than people had been sort of orienting around. Because to get to something like a 1.5 degrees trajectory, you have to do even deeper cuts, and you have to do them a lot faster than most people had been sort of, I think, planning for. The second sort of piece is obviously the last 4 years, we should have been going in overdrive on climate action. The intention was that we would have come out of the Paris Agreement with a floor. We always sort of articulated the Paris Agreement as the beginning, not the end of the international climate effort. What countries put on the table was a important step forward, but clearly we needed much more. And I know Yamid will talk about some of the kind of milestones, but so we had, I think, anticipated that the last 4 years we wouldn't just be playing defense, but we would actually be playing offense. Thankfully, a number of countries continued to move forward on climate progress. The U.S. is the only country not in the Paris Agreement, despite lots of interest in some other countries to withdraw because they wanted to align with Trump. Nobody else withdrew, but unfortunately, without kind of U.S. leadership, it's hard to carry forward the kind of assertive international agenda that was kind of working in overdrive that we needed. So we have a lot of making up to do on that front. So we put together with a group of folks. Let's see if I can get to the next slide. Sorry. Let's see.
Just use your arrows.
Yeah, it's not working for some reason. Sorry, let me pull it up as a PowerPoint. Sorry about that. Is that better? Can you guys see that? Okay,
Yep.
that'll work. Then it was like in a preview screen or something. So we worked with a group of folks. I won't read all this out, but we wrote a piece with a couple of folks in foreign affairs, which is sort of where foreign policy types go to read stuff. I don't tend to write articles, but this is, we wanted to sort of make a case, which is the U.S. needs to have a climate first foreign policy, we called it. Which you can use whatever analogy you want in the international frame, but when the U.S. has on the foreign policy agenda a particular thing that it's driving every action towards, then it means that everything in the foreign policy space is kind of focused around driving and oriented to driving that agenda. So the Cold War, we did that. Nuclear non-proliferation, the U.S. kind of drove that agenda. And what that means is that every tool of the U.S. foreign policy is being used to drive a climate agenda, which even in the best days of the Obama administration, we were close, but not all the way there in terms of driving the agenda, and we were definitely not doing it at the urgency, the scale, and the pace that we wanted. So we or sorry, there's a bit of a delay. Use this thing. So we worked with a group of 60 kind of leading experts, both from the NGO space, a number of folks that were kind of former Obama administration people, development groups, think tanks, national security folks, kind of experts in international climate, to put together what would an agenda look like if you were trying to drive climate change as a top tier foreign policy priority, and how would that operationalize in terms of kind of key details. So I'm going to provide just very top level on it. I'll share at the end a link to the report. Would love your all comments on it. If you have thoughts on it, feel free to send them my way. So what we sort of outlined, as I said, is let's make climate change the organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy. And that means a couple of things as we kind of articulated. First, it means that the U.S. is organized, it acts, and it executes on this as a top priority. So, I think the way to think about this is what is a Secretary of State have as his top agenda, or her top agenda when they go in to meet with a foreign counterpart? Is it climate change is on the list of 5, or is it that climate change is number 1 and there's 4 other things that get kind of added to the list by the nuclear non-proliferation, the human rights folks, etc., like that kind of orient that sort of piece. The second piece, and I think that this is very sort of important as we've been thinking about it, is coming out of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was much more oriented around let's negotiate an agreement, let's get the text of the agreement, let's get countries to align around it. We're moving to a phase now where it's about implementation. There's some details that still have to be worked out in terms of the actual agreement, but the real attention needs to focus on how do we drive this agenda in national capitals, boardrooms, city mayors' offices, etc. And so as you think about orienting your climate agenda that way, it means that you're not just having climate driven by the normal environment climate people in these agencies, but the unusual suspects. So the trade agenda people are pushing this, the people that are pushing the export agenda are pushing this, the democracy people are pushing it, whatever the sort of side of the agenda you want to look at, that it's being driven not just by the usual suspects. And so that means it's really important that you get good people in those positions, those non-traditional slots. So for example, the environmental community, for the international, we've always tended to sort of focus on who's kind of the international climate envoy, and that matters, but we also need to care who's the undersecretary at State Department for Business Affairs, because we should not have the former VP of Coca-Cola there. We should have the former VP of Solar Industry X or whatever, right? To give you an example. The third piece of this agenda really sort of looks at, for other foreign policy priorities, it's very typical to use a full suite of tools. And for the climate agenda, we've almost entirely focused on the so-called carrots, so the kind of incentive side of the picture. We'll provide some financial support to aid you in this effort, and we'll kind of tell you when you're doing the wrong thing, but there's no real consequences for it. But for nuclear nonproliferation, if you're building out a bomb, the threat of sanctions, tariffs, etc., is real and tends to be sort of unleashed. And so we would argue that kind of in this era, we need to think about the sticks as much as the carrots in the kind of international climate agenda. So it means, looking at things like, restrictions on selling your products to America if you're not aligned with the climate strategy, or maybe, having kind of tariffs on products that, sort of don't cover the kind of equal climate commitments of the U.S. And then the last piece of this agenda is really around, if you're going to be successful, you have to do this in multiple forums with multiple countries and in multiple ways. I know everybody always likes to say, give me your 3 priorities. And, that's always kind of the comms kind of messaging, but the reality of climate change and the reality of the international climate agenda, as an aspect is you can't solve this by just having a singular country strategy. So the Obama administration, I think rightly focused on its international agenda was, largely focused around China, India, and the Paris Agreement. But to be successful in this decade, it's going to mean having a China, India, Paris Agreement strategy, but also a deep Mexico strategy, a Brazil strategy, a Europe strategy, an Indonesia strategy to pull along those other players. So we looked at, and as I said, I'll kind of cover these in broad brush to leave enough time for question. Sort of a four-part agenda that we sort of oriented. One is to organize for global leadership. You have to kind of have the right people, set yourself up right. Deploy through diplomacy, working one-on-one with individual governments, but also through multilateral agreements like the Paris Agreement and others. And then shifting investments in key economic sectors in the right direction. And then last is a sort of resilience, national security to the impacts of climate change, because obviously we are going to be facing climate impacts. We have to orient ourselves to that and deal with the consequences, hopefully mitigate them to a large extent, but they are real. So with the sort of the first piece, as I said, who's in these positions and how the structure is set up matters a ton. Obviously, I think some of this is becoming clearer to the day as announcements come out. So with Secretary Kerry being the presidential special envoy, it's kind of clear who's going to be leading the international kind of engagement on that front. Obviously, I expect, who knows, maybe later this week we'll be hearing who the domestic counterpart is in the White House, and some of those other sort of pieces. The second piece of this agenda is we really need to make sure that the entirety of the U.S. government is rowing in the right direction. So, we had, the Obama administration pushing for the climate agenda, but we had parts of the State Department pushing Keystone XL, for example, or pushing a natural gas expansion both through LNG and around the world. And we need to have all the parts of the U.S. government, moving the right direction, so we're not sort of having to, push back on some of these forces that are kind of organizing the wrong direction. And then the last piece is, and we need to put some more thought to this, but for a lot of times for government, it helps to have a goal, right? What is the organizing principle that they're going to be driving for? So we want to make sure that U.S. kind of foreign assistance activities are driven towards a particular goal. It could be we want to have this amount of money drive an extra billions tons of cuts through deforestation action, internationally, or it could be we want to have, 1 billion electric vehicles around the world, and we're going to drive our climate agenda to do that, to phase out coal, to meet some renewables targets. The next piece of the agenda, and I'll just cover this kind of briefly, is there's a series of countries that are really important, as folks know, that sort of matter. And as I mentioned, you need to have, not just the China strategy, but also an Indonesia strategy. So, the if you guys don't haven't picked up on this, but the relationship between the U.S. and China is not great right now. But China is the world's largest emitter, twice the United States emissions. The U.S. has to find a way to encourage, cajole, and convince China to be more aggressive on climate change. What China has brought forward to date is good, but insufficient for what we're going to need them over the next 10 years to deliver. The second sort of piece is, India is the fourth largest emitter in the world. It's one of the faster growing ones. Obviously has, hundreds of millions of people still living in extreme poverty. Has been doing a lot of very positive things on the climate agenda. And I think there's an opportunity for the U.S. to sort of engage directly with them to kind of help to move them forward much more aggressively. The Indian side is very excited about somebody with an Indian background sitting in the vice president's office. So I think there's an opportunity to use Vice President Harris to kind of help to drive that India agenda as well. And then the third piece, which is going to be even more important, I think, going forward, is, Europe is a strong leader on climate change, has been one of the drivers of climate action around the world. The U.S. is going to have to figure out how to better work with the Europeans to align strategies and make sure that they're kind of moving in the right direction. In particular, as the Europeans have a pretty ongoing dialogue with China and India and some other countries, so it'll be important to make sure that we're kind of focused on that. And then there's strategies for some of the other countries that are kind of, I'd say moving, have kind of a mixed picture. Unfortunately, our southern neighbor, Mexico, is under the current administration is going quite in the wrong direction. So it's going to be important to use some tools to see if we can turn them back around. Brazil, under a very Trump-like person, is driving deforestation in the Amazon, which is obviously not a great thing. And places like Indonesia have a massive coal build out in their pipeline, as well as ongoing deforestation challenges. And lastly, our northern neighbors have a very green halo to themselves, but some of their actions are not so great on things like tar sands and the destruction of the Canadian boreal forest. So the other part, and I'll just cover these sort of quickly, of the kind of diplomacy agenda, is there's some other international forums that are really important, like the Montreal Protocol, and obviously the Paris Agreement. And then the third piece that I'll just kind of put on your radar, because I don't think it gets as much attention, but obviously there's a large, Biden was the second leader to use the Build Back Better frame. The UN had been talking about it for quite a period of time. So as folks know, how the US and other countries use their recovery from the COVID to either lock in bad carbon infrastructure investments or drive a much better agenda is really important. That's a central component of, I think, what the US is going to have to do as it kind of gets its footing around what its domestic Build Back Better agenda is and how it can drive that, is how to sort of help lead the charge of using that internationally to make sure that the whole world is building back better. And there's unfortunately a big challenge coming, that a large number of the poorest countries in the world have a major debt crisis that they're facing. And as we're asking them to deal with the health implications and make some smart investments in climate change, they have this huge debt payment kind of overhanging them in the next 2 years in quite a significant way, and that's obviously going to put pressure on them to pay back the debtors as opposed to making investments that are good for their people and the planet. And so we're going to have to create a conversation around how to sort of deal with that debt crisis in a way that allows them to meet some of these other objectives as well. The sort of third part of the agenda, and I'll just highlight a couple that I think are worth paying even particular close attention to, is, as I said, we're going to have to make sure that the administration is driving a clean growth first. We call it policy for overseas investments. So that means not pushing out LNG, but instead prioritizing renewables and energy efficiency in terms of all of our public assistance. It means things like increasing the U.S. contribution to the Green Climate Fund, the multilateral fund. We call for a doubling of that fund, or the U.S. contribution to that fund. But it also means making sure that we're leveraging, things like U.S. export agenda to drive the renewables agenda, so that the renewables products that we're producing in the U.S. can be sold to overseas markets simultaneously, creating hopefully more jobs in the U.S. for the production and manufacturing and export of those technologies, those opportunities, instead of having the U.S. be the leader of oil and gas exports overseas and kind of the jobs that sort of come with that sort of piece of the puzzle. And then the other piece that I think is worth really paying attention to is, the trade agenda for every administration has never had a climate component to it. We pushed around, my organization pushed around the Trans-Pacific Partnership to include climate commitments. We tried to push around the redo of the NAFTA agreement, but it's ridiculous in this era to not have climate change as a part of your trade agenda, because how the U.S. exports, imports, the decisions it makes about its trade agenda shapes so many market factors. And so it's really important that the U.S. has climate change kind of centrally integrated into the trade agenda, which means sort of putting a halt to all new trade agreements, and inserting climate change more forcefully into that agenda in particular ways. Hopefully it also means reopening up the redo of the NAFTA agreement to insert climate agendas into that, to see if we can push Mexico to be more aggressive. And then the last piece of the agenda is obviously, as I said, the U.S. and the rest of the world are, facing reality of climate impacts. We have not, as a society, mobilized enough action fast enough to avoid this, and that has both national security implications. If you talk to military folks, they're quite worried about the instability that will occur because of climate impacts happening in places around the world. So, places like the Sahel in Africa, as you see droughts continue to take hold, it causes migration, it causes conflicts. There's some studies on whether or not Syria was caused by climate change, but, there's a kind of growing kind of risk on that side. And then the other piece of the agenda is, clearly, there's, both in the U.S. and around the world, the communities, the countries that have contributed the least to this, to the contribution of greenhouse gas emissions, are going to be suffering the most from it. And so there needs to be an effort to try to help those countries build greater resilience to these impacts. Obviously, there needs to be a domestic agenda as well for that, to make sure that we're minimizing the damage, helping countries, communities, continue to find ways to survive. For many countries around the world, this is a matter of life or death. It's a matter of whether or not their country's going to survive and be underwater. So we definitely have to have that a part of the agenda. So the last piece I'll end you with, in is obviously you might be asking, or maybe not, but why does all this matter? Just as a couple of reminders of I think sort of why it's really important that the U.S. has an assertive international climate agenda. The U.S. is only 15% of the world's emissions. It's that's a lot in most countries, but there's 85% of the problem that has to be addressed outside of the U.S. borders. If we are going to solve climate change and protect Americans, we also have to make sure that the rest of the 85% are doing things aggressively in climate change. Second, is I think it's quite obvious that America's leadership has been critical to driving climate action. When the Obama administration was pushing very aggressively, it could help to mobilize greater action from other countries. Clearly, the U.S. has been weakened over the past 4 years, in its international, eyes, given the Trump administration, but it still has influence. It's still one of the largest markets in the world. It's a major financial hub. Everybody is on the New York Stock Exchange. A lot of countries trade in American dollars. And the policies that America adopts do have a kind of ripple around the world. And so it's really important for, the international agenda that the U.S. is driven that. Now, all that said, clearly the U.S. cannot only have an international agenda. The U.S. must have a strong domestic agenda. It has to be driving down its domestic emissions. I think, as Biden likes to say, what does he say? U.S. is at its best when it leads by the power of its example, not the example of its power, which is basically saying the U.S. is best internationally when it has its own house in order, and then it can sort of translate that into kind of international leadership around the world. So that's why I said, at the outset, even though the U.S. and international agendas can often be kind of in their own track, there is a huge overlap in the sense that as the U.S. goes into these international engagements, if it does not have a strong domestic agenda, it has limited leverage to try to influence other countries to be more bold and aggressive on the climate agenda. So it's really important that we all collectively push the U.S. as hard as they can to get its domestic house in order and drive that agenda, and then use that kind of power to try to influence the rest of the 85 to come along for the ride. So I will stop, and I'm happy to share these slides with folks, but there's a couple of links if folks want to read more on this agenda. And if you have any questions on stuff, both now and later on, happy to take any questions now.
Great. Thank you, Jake. We're actually going to hold questions till the presentations are over, and that way we can really just dive into the conversation from both the perspectives that you presented and what Yamid will present. So Yamid, the floor is yours. And you're muted, Yamid, just in case before you start to talk. You're still muted on my end, Yamid.
Okay, sorry, do you see my screen?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, so hi everyone, nice to meet you all. I'm Yamid, I am the Director on Climate Negotiations at the World Resource Institute. I've been a former negotiator for the UK, for the EU, also for the Belgian presidency of the EU during Cancun. And during the Paris Agreement, I was an advisor to the chair of the least developed countries too, while I had joined the BRI. What I'm going to try to do is to give you a bit of equity lens to understand, where therefore, equity would, where why equity would matter in the issues that we will need to consider in the next 2 to 5 years. And now you have the kind of very diplomatic but very strategic context from Jake about why the US needs to consider all of these issues from a very an American interest kind of a way, but also what the role of the US is going to have, for the rest of the world. And it's going to definitely impact, the negotiation. So what I'm going to try to do now in the first slide is just to remember, the first equity dimension comes from this arc of ambition that the Paris Agreement, asks us to consider. In 2015, countries agreed that we're going to decarbonize our economy and be carbon neutral by 2050, by the middle of the century. The first equity point is, yes, a global decarbonization, but it means that some countries, will be carbon neutral a little bit later, and you can see that from some NDCs, and some will need to be carbon neutral a bit earlier. And then, because countries were asked ahead of Paris to tell what their plans, where their climate plans, how their climate plans are going to contribute to that global goal, they were asked to produce what we call those NDC, nationally determined contribution. And in 2015, when you put all those NDCs together, they were adding up to almost a 3-degree kind of trajectory if they were implemented. So there was a lot of risks that we were very well into a dangerous path. So because they were well aware of that, they asked all countries to come back to the table every 5 years, that they will need to step up their actions and also the means to implement those actions, to try to scale them up all the time, every 5 years, right? And this is where we are. We are today in 2020. And this is why on Saturday, you had a climate summit organized by the next presidency of the COP. But we've also the UN Secretary General, the UNFCCC Secretariat, but also the French, who had hosted, that very historical COP, and the pre-COP, and they try to have all countries to come back and to say what they're going to really do in stepping up as stipulated by the Paris Agreement. And there were some mixed results. Good momentum, but probably not enough. But just to bear in mind this trajectory. So every 5 years, so we're in 2020 now. In 2025, we need to do better. And in order to stimulate us to do better, there will be what we call a global stocktake mechanism, where countries will take stock of where they are, where they need to be, and how to get to where they need to be. And this particular mechanism, global stocktake, is important because it's not going to be just driven by countries. It will need to be driven also with the participation of non-state actors like you. And the conversation needs to be based on equity. It needs to be based on equity and science. So the International Panel on Climate Change is going to produce a report that really also provide the state of affairs, how far we got to, if we are closer to 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5, and we will not. But what also has been the trends in terms of impacts, were we even more conservative than actually the reality, and how we can really change the course. The economics, looking at the economics, the technology, called opportunities, but the societal opportunities, the consumption production patterns that we need to change, and also look at equity. So, based on this, some countries, also have to think, okay, globally we're not good, but some countries, even if they increase their ambition, they need to do much more because it's not their fair share. It's not their fair share on equity, actually, from an equity point of view. They need to do way better because they have been responsible for a lot more of the problem that we have done. And they're supposed to be more capable to do more because of their level of advancement and development. While some countries, and this is what we've seen, even if we've seen some good signals and, all the countries that Jake had presented really matters because they're the major emitters, they're the G20s. So we will need to pay attention of what the EU, China, India are doing, Mexico, Canada. But what we've seen is that vulnerable countries have been really, charging and demonstrating leadership. They're the one who have contributed the least to the problem, but they wanted to demonstrate to the world, hey, if we can do this and we want to be carbon neutral, you big guys, you can also do. So they've been a very moral drivers to try to make sure that we're on a course to not just 2, actually 1.5. And if in the Paris Agreement, 1.5 was included, is because of the equity push and climate justice push that vulnerable countries have been really insisted and campaigning. So that this is why the Paris Agreement says, reaching 2 degrees, but also striving, when if possible, to 1.5. And the latest IPCC report in 2018 demonstrated that 0.5 degree of difference makes a huge difference when it comes to the impacts and what it means to our economy. So this is just the global picture. These slides represent really the stakes, where we are going to go, and the processes in place to try to make sure that we're going to get there. And it means that when a country said to you, oh yes, we're going to decarbonize to be carbon neutral by 2050, great, but we want to see how serious you are and how predictable you're going to be by seeing, some more nearer term objectives. So by 2030, what you're going to do, because you can say that and do nothing and then be really off track of meeting and doing what you're supposed to be doing. So the second element is, okay, so this is our objective. This is what Paris tells us to do. In the COP, what to watch for, especially as the US is back. During the COP26, that has been postponed actually from this year to next year, there's 3 buckets of issues, that you will need to look at. The issue of ambition. So, Jake told you that we need to see a good ambition from the US, and why? So the Biden administration said that they're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. Good. Now the US, we need to come back with a good also NDC by 2030. So that's going to be a challenge, and we will see how other countries are going to step up. And this is in the context of recovery, right? So we know this is going to be very difficult. And for some, from an equity and justice point of view, for a lot of other countries, more vulnerable, it's going to be very much in the context of sustainable development, the debt crisis, generated and exacerbated also by the COVID crisis. In addition, what Paris has done is not just be mitigation focused. And you heard Jake use the term resilience and adaptation a lot, and in the context of national security. Then the second pillar is really also, the resilience. So ambition in terms of resilience and adaptation, our ability to be less vulnerable, is going to be looked at as well. And in order to make this happen, you need finance, right? So the finance is going to be also considered. So that's one element that you need to bear in mind. And we will need not to wait to the COP to see where we are. Throughout the year, you will hear news about, what countries are doing to ramp up ambition. And a lot of NGOs, the NGO community, will hold their governments accountable to do what it takes, to do their fair share, to do as far as they can. the second pillar is negotiations. The Paris Agreement tells you what to do. And then in 2018 in Katowice, countries, try to decide how to do that. What would be the rules of the game to do that in an equitable and level playing field way, and in a transparent, so that we can hold our countries accountable. Well, when, whilst 80% of the rules have been, adopted, almost maybe more, some rules are still outstanding, and they would matter. And one of them is on markets. And I'm going the use of market mechanisms. And some of you have heard, it's a very sensitive issue for some. And, because if the rules are not robust, it can create a lot of loopholes. And countries can use markets and actually bluff and actually undermine really, their efforts to really increase their ambition. So this is, the rules of the games. There's going to be discussions on that. There's going to be also discussions on adaptation, loss and damage. Adaptation is, especially we're going to see, for a lot of countries, developing countries, there hasn't been enough prioritization of these issues on how we move forward on that, and let alone loss and damage. I'm going to go into, the details. And loss and damage is when you try to adapt, actually you reach your limit to adapt. You just generate economic and non-economic, including cultural losses. And, this is very existential. And again, for many, it's an issue of climate justice. It's an issue of equity, to minimize that. And in the Paris Agreement, it's fair to say that it was one of the most sensitive issues. And in order to get an agreement to even recognize the loss and damage as a pillar, the US and a lot of developed countries really ask for, leaving away the issue of liability and compensation. And that was a compromise under which this issue was tabled and is part of the Paris Agreement. We're going to go a little bit more in detail. Another block, a lot of things are happening outside the negotiations. Countries are actually trying to get some initiatives done, not just within countries, but also the whole non-state actors. And this is important, and the role of non-state actors is important. Even when the US left the Paris Agreement, you had this campaign, "We are still in." And because private companies, cities decided, well, even if we don't have our administration on track, we will do our part. It is in our interest, and they have demonstrated some progress there. But for some countries, so you have joint initiative with private, with government and non-state actors, but you do have also some continental, regional-led initiatives, and we need to make sure that it's not just, those COP are not just events where yes, let's do this and let's do this, and none of these are being implemented. Otherwise, again, it's becoming just a show, and it increase issue of equity. But yes, that there's a good accountable, process, to make sure that this is happening and this is translated into the ground. So just, just to remind yourself, even if you have those three buckets, when you come to pay, to consider what is at stake for the COP, the next COP, it's about ambition, for climate action, mitigation side, but climate impacts and resilience are going to become more important too. Knowing that reducing emissions is actually one of the first measures to adapt, and finance, the finance agenda. It's going to be all cross-cutting. Now, this is, I'm not going to go into this, it's just for you. I actually touched upon that a little bit already. But if you look at, what it means for equity and ambition, during the COP, when here it's what this slide is about, what to expect the signals of the COP to to be seen as equitable, fair, and ambitious enough. When it comes to the issue of ambition, well, by the 2 weeks of the COP, you will have a number of climate plans, those NDC, nationally determined contribution. So in a COP decision, you would expect to have an acknowledgement as to the progress made, to close a gap of the emission in terms of emission, but also how close we are in reducing, how many degrees, would change if we put together all those climate plans. Are we going to be closer to 2.2, or what change would it make? And still flag the challenges for not going quicker, because even if there's progress, it's not fast enough. So we need to have a decision that tells, yes, okay, progress, but hey, not enough. We need to do more. There's a commitment, therefore, to accelerate, and especially to bring more support to really to give good signals for the market and investors as to where they need to reorient their flow, and in the context of recovery. And also because this stock-taking exercise that culminates in 2023 start actually just after the COP, and we need to make sure that we have the right foundations to really make the most of it. Now, another issue is how we transition from everything that happens pre-2020 and post-2020. And I'm raising this because for some developing countries is a very important issue of equity. We're going to leave the previous decade, which is so often said to be a lost decade. We've, a lot of gaps left by developed countries, and they would feel like, a lot of developing countries will have to really step up and cover for some of the gaps. What we do with the gaps in an equitable manner, it's not clear. And there's tension. Developed countries would say, look, let's change that mindset now. We're all in this together. This is Paris. We're all in this together. Let's just do all our best. But for some countries, it's like, yes, our best, but, there's differences. So I think there's still going to be a tension that we will need to address and find a way to concern. So I just wanted to mention that particular debate here. I talked about the rules. So the market mechanisms, we still have not, agreed how to use market mechanisms. And if we don't have those rules, we could have double counting and claiming. So it disturbs, our sense of, progress. There's also the market mechanisms is supposed to generate, the revenue generated. Developing countries are asking for it to be used to support the adaptation actions and to go to an adaptation fund, which is a smaller fund, but very important because it goes to at local level, at community level. And for them, it's very important to maintain that. So, how to make sure, this is going to happen, and how, the old system using markets and the new system, how you're going to transition and to make sure that you don't generate, what we call hot air, that again, it disturbs, environmental integrity. And then there's also in this, the issue of safeguard and human rights, and this is also, an element of equity. Transparency, how to make sure that you account for all of this, is important. And for developing countries, the transparency requirement, what you have to measure, to report, to review, is much more stringent under the Paris Agreement. And for them, that could be more burdensome. So, when you transition, what type of flexibility you allow and what type of capacity building and training you're going to put in place to enable them to really do that. And since this is a precondition to participate in any carbon market trading, you know, for countries, developing countries who don't want to be left behind from those kind of opportunities, it's a very important point as well. And then there's also, you know, when to decide the end date. We're talking about 2030, but you know, for future NDCs, it's not clear whether you're going to have a 5-year implementation period or 10 years. And if you're left, you know, comparing apple mangoes, everybody does what it wants. It's not, it's very complicated. You know, how can you compare trade when, you know, the timing by when you need to do something is different? You know, it's also raised some issues of equity. Adaptation, you know, the goal. So, you know, we have a very clear goal on, very quantified goal on mitigation. Adaptation is not clear, and developing countries have been asking for clarity on how we really appraise all the efforts. You know, so that's a very important, you know, aspect. On loss and damage, you know, what type of technical assistance to really help countries to support loss and damage? You know, what would be the finance, you know, how to attract better finance for loss and damage. And the reason is because a lot of the financial mechanism within the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC so far has been constructed around mitigation, adaptation, right? And, you know, forestry in between. But loss and damage, which emerged as a pillar under the Paris Agreement per se, it's not clear whether there's going to be dedicated support for loss and damage, right? Those losses and damages are just increasing. So this is an important point for developing countries. And, you know, I talked about some initiative already. And then finance, you will hear, and this is an important, point for the US. There's, you know, doing what you said you would be doing for the reporting, assessing the needs from countries, developing countries, where we go. But yes, we said that we would meet 100 billion, well, developed countries, and they're not meeting that target. They're not fulfilling that target yet. And Paris says by 2025 there need to be a new target, because we just need to actually mobilize the trillions. We should not talk even about billion, but trillions to really, you know, keep us safe. So this is also issues that needs to be, you know, undertaken, and capacity building, empowerment, you know, gender, the role of indigenous people, you know, all of these, you know, are also something that, you know, that will resonate and be discussed, you know, during the next COP. So the last 2 slides are very quick. You know, it's just, you know, you've seen how complex this is. I try, you know, to give you all the examples where equity will matter. You know, I will, you know, actually Tina already has the slides, so you can digest, and I don't mind, you know, answering any question. But, you know, in order to get an agreement that to bring all of those, you know, this package, you will need to really take into account of a lot of things that, you know, Jake has mentioned. But managing the political, economical, and societal circumstances, which differs from country to country, is going to be important, which is why the US coming back into the game, we need to have some dedicated, you know, strategies for different countries. You know, there's a kind of the level of trust between developed and developing countries it's quite low. It's a little bit of what you see in country between the rich and, you know, the poor. So there's a little bit of, you know, the more vulnerable communities, you know, feel that they can very much be left out, and there's a disconnect, and we need to bring that trust back into the multilateral processes as well. The timeline, the deadlines, and access both to information, finance, all those issues will matter to make sure that, you know, what we're going to generate is implementable. The type of leadership is going to be important. The type of leadership that, you know, the US is going to bring back onto the table, that China will, you know, will demonstrate, but also vulnerable countries which have demonstrated, you know, leadership, you know, for so long. how is it going to really affect everything? The EU will have a different also, but very important leadership. G7, G20, how all those powers, are going to work, to get to where we need to be. And, the transparency of the process. And it links very much to inclusion. And this is where, you participating in the process, we need to consider the issue of inclusion and participation. The UNFCCC process is very country driven. And when you see, the party driven in yellow, and then, you have the whole group of G77 in China, but within that, you do have different groupings, small islands, least developed countries. And then outside these developing countries, you have the EU, you have, the US and others. Then you have to take into account those microcosms because, some countries have smaller delegation than others to look at all those things that I told you in even more, right? So that's also an issue of equity to help them to be equipped to push for the most ambitious and fair agenda for them. And in addition, you have the participation of civil society and business. And since the first conference, it allowed to do that. Now, to which extent, we as civil society, we influence outcome, I think you should not look at just the COP, the 2 weeks. You need to look at what needs to be done ahead of it. First of all, understanding the agenda, what needs to be pushed, having, engaging in advocacy campaign, but doing the analysis, to give you that robustness and legitimacy to make the case. And during the COP, to really continue to put pressure, and after the COP, to implement, what the COP says. So it's really, a cycle of engagement, and, to make everything compelling. And I will stop there. Thank you for listening. It was a little bit longer than I thought, but I hope you found it useful.
Yamid, that was really wonderful, and Jake as well. So first, I just want to just say thank you for preparing those presentations, and I found them to be very informative, but I also really like the wonky part of this stuff. So, but I want to open the floor for questions from the participants. There was one in the chat, and so I just want to go to that just in case the question was not answered. So what role does equity and justice have in the Paris Agreement? And Susanna, did you get your response, or were you looking for something more?
I would really like to hear from the panelists, if possible.
Yeah, but so Yamid talked about equity in her presentation. So I'm asking you if what she shared, was that sufficient, or was there something more you were looking for?
Well, she said conservation must be based on equity and science. I didn't know if she wanted to elaborate on that just a little bit more.
Conservation, or?
You had said conservation must be based on equity and science.
So I think it was not necessarily conservation. So the effort that we're going to be, the effort that countries are doing collectively, to reduce emission, to adapt, and to scale up finance, that collective effort will need to be appraised on the basis of equity and science. So normally there's going to be a science report ahead of these kind of discussions, to look at really where we are, where we need to be, what can be done. But when it comes to equity, some countries, will come with, let's say, an emission reduction target of -50. If that country is a big one, is very advanced, and if its responsibility in the past was, they represent like, 10% of the emissions of global emissions, then we need to figure out whether their plan is ambitious, is fair, is equitable, if they're doing their fair share compared to others. So some countries will not be able to be as ambitious because their contribution is 0.0000, you know. So, but you know, being carbon neutral is a big deal, and some others, in, you know, for example, from China, the US, EU, we would be expecting a lot more. From Canada, we would be expecting a lot more. When Canada is going to say what they're going to do, we need to figure out whether it's fair, whether they need to do more, and also if, you know, we're going to get enough time, you know, if to really get to carbon neutrality and to change the thermometer in time before getting very dangerous, you know, dangerous climate. So this is, you know, the equity, one aspect of the equity, or not conversation, conservation, but the whole ambition agenda. But then there's also equity when you look at other issues that matters, like, you know, loss and damage, or, you know, equity when it comes to the access of funding, which is still very difficult for some countries to really decarbonize, you know, some economy. And the US can, coming back on the table, can really play a role in supporting you know, some, you know, for example, on finance, in playing its fair part too.
Yeah, and just add a little bit to what Yamid said, especially as we think about the U.S. Piece of this. That, you know, the funding is really important for that conversation, because you know, we don't always frame it this way because it doesn't always sell in Congress, but the reality is that the funding, you know, the U.S. Obligations in some sense to contribute finance to help developing countries, you know, reduce emissions and deal with the impacts of climate change, is partly stemmed from a recognition that, you know, for the past 200 plus years now, U.S. and other major countries, right, have been contributing emissions to the atmosphere that we are now seeing as the impacts today. So how you can't you know, you can't go back in time and take away those emissions, so you have to sort of help the most vulnerable that are feeling the impacts of this, or the extremely poor countries that are trying to pull billions of people out of poverty. And so how do you do that in some kind of equitable, fair way? And one of the ways that the international community sort of tried to deal with that is financial commitments. So the financial commitments, you know, apply to the developed countries because they were the biggest contributors to the historical contributions of climate change, and that's therefore kind of piece of the puzzle. And that's why, you know, I think it's really important for the, you know, we're gonna have to make a big push to get U.S. back at the table and making international contributions, you know, to that agenda. You know, we didn't do as bad under the Trump administration as you might have expected. They didn't zero out all that funding, but, you know, clearly, U.S. is going to have to kind of step up its bilateral assistance through things like the Green Climate Fund, but also through the many other channels that are going to be used to help countries, help the, you know, the most vulnerable countries in the world deal with the impacts, build stronger resilience, and then help them kind of choose the low carbon economic pathway instead of what most of the developed countries have chosen, which is build out the fossil fuel industry and then try to clean it up. And we obviously can't afford that with this next generation of kind of economic drivers in some of the poorest countries in the world.
I have a quick question, sort of in alignment with this one on equity, because from both of your presentations, what I appreciated was sort of the contextualizing the actual idea of equity in this framework of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, and how it actually fits into this broader, very popular idea of the COPs, Conference of the Parties, and then you have the G7 and the G20. But equity is defined in a different way, but similar way at this level, because it's really working at this high level political environment. And so my question is, how does the work that has been laid out, one, in preparation for participating or being part of COP26, and two, the American or the US agenda on climate action, how does that equity lens actually become part of the national effort to get the US to do its job at that level from a subnational or a national state level where communities, civil society engages? Like, where's that connective tissue? Because we work from environmental justice perspective, equity and justice lens, and we're pushing for regulations and we're policy that actually impacts the way in which we are governed at our state level, for the cumulative impacts that our communities feel. But that doesn't necessarily seem to be translating up into the international space, the way in which you all are talking about equity, and how that work happens. So can you just talk about where there's that opportunity to connect these variations on the same word? Because they're the same, but they're different from my perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what you mean you should jump into, because that's a very good question. I think there's a couple of ways. One, I think, so as Yamid mentioned, the U.S. is going to be expected to put on the table very fast a 2030 climate target. So it currently has a 26 to 28%, climate target for 2025. It's going to be, I don't know what the exact time frame is, but let's say within 100 days of inauguration day, they're going to be expected to put together what the ambition level is that they're going to be driving kind of U.S. climate policy for. I think the 2025 target was developed a little quicker. There wasn't as much time to kind of build people and support. So I think obviously it's going to be really central that that has political support across the board, and that is going to obviously include a pretty powerful hopefully voices from the folks on this call, the environmental justice and other kind of crowd or groups to be sort of making the case for bold and ambition is important for I mean, I will say, like, I think the framing can be like, we do all these other things and it happens to also simultaneously address climate change, right? So like making the case that building that bold climate agenda for the domestic piece solves is a way, as you guys, as others have been framing, to solve the local air pollution, solve the toxic buildups, solve all these other things, and it happens to solve the climate crisis, right? At the same time, it's kind of the climate is the co-benefit. So I think that's one way, and I think it's going to be really important to kind of build that in a lot better than was done in the last time. As I said, it was kind of a quick process, and it wasn't time, I think, and or capacity to really have that much deeper dialogue. So I would definitely engage in that agenda as that process starts. I think the second piece is, obviously, it's as the U.S. is kind of trying to convince other countries, if it has its own domestic house not in order, then that has, it limits its ability to convince the world. So if the U.S. is, for example, is the U.S. is trying to convince the rest of the world to be good on democracy, it's not helpful if we don't have a democracy that's working in our own country. But it's also true for, if the U.S. is trying to say, why are you disenfranchising indigenous communities in the Brazilian Amazon, Bolsonaro, if the U.S. has a pretty poor story to tell of its own, communities, it loses its influence, its leverage on some of those kind of pieces. So those, I think, are sort of two off the top of my head, real quick. But it's a good question. So I don't know, Yamid, if
Yes, no, I think
I'm sure I missed stuff.
Maybe I wanted to bring the resilience and impact side actually to complement your point, because that could also resonate with the work that environmental and justice groups are trying to do. When you look at the impacts the US needs to do its share because, countries like the US and China, if they don't do, we're continuing to have all the impacts. And guess what? Who is going to be most affected? Not only vulnerable countries, but vulnerable communities. So the US has to do it, has to do its part. And what I would say is that, when you look at the vulnerable countries narrative, you could cut and paste that narrative into the vulnerable communities in any countries. You see what they're seeing, the fight that they're playing, they're undergoing at multilateral, at international level. This is the same fight that vulnerable communities are going through internally in each countries. So one thing that could be helpful for such networks like, NBEJN is really to try to grapple and almost to decipher, those narrative, and those vulnerable countries, those representative are really eloquent and powerful. They've been a more voice. So doing the same at national level, could eventually, at that level of sophistication, could be quite interesting also to kind of consider, because this is really the same. When you look at, what's happening in Louisiana and Katrina, hey, when a developing country, when Kiribati, he's telling you that they need to figure out where to put, they will, have to deal with climate refugee. How different is it from, Louisiana, where you have people displaced also because of the sea level rise, tidal problems and, flooding, but also salinization of, agricultural lands. And, all of these issues, are amplified at national level for those small countries. But this is things that you see already, faced by vulnerable countries. When you talk about, food deserts in, for our network, this is also what, some vulnerable countries are facing. So you could have some, it's a level of scale, but I think, from a campaigning, advocacy, and even analytical point of view, there's a lot, of similarity that could be, looked at. And similarly on finance, the access to finance, and some countries are trying to look at, microfinance or, different type of grid. Well, can some of the things that are considered for, least developed countries can be actually done for, some very poor neighborhoods, to try to empower them. So can we use a little bit of the same, that we see in international to the national? And can we bring the insight from the national to the national, to win this game? So I just wanted to create, that, those, analogies.
Yeah, no, that was great. I really appreciated it. And I think that is definitely the work that we need to think through, not just as an environmental justice community, but as the environment or climate space, how that we connect these dots together. So Michael Johnson, I'll read your question if you want. He's asking what has been let me make sure I get it correctly. How has the coronavirus impacted the COP25 efforts? And folks, if you have questions, you can either type them in the chat or you can just speak up on your own or raise your hand. So the question is, how's the coronavirus impacting the COP25 efforts? What's been the impact?
Well, the impact has been a postponement of the next COP. So, normally we should have, Jake and I would have been back from 2 weeks of, negotiations. And this is all postponed till next year. So it had delayed some of the progress, some of the things you need to discuss face to face, between countries. And, some, the trying to do things virtually. So over the past, end of November, beginning of December, you had 2 weeks of climate negotiators brought together with non-state actors, about 8,000 of them, online to try to look at some of the issues that are unresolved that they need to deal with. Because of some access issues to the technology, it was agreed that there will be no decision, no formal decisions, coming from that. But it would create a space to start to unpack and to look at some options on how to move forward. So I'm just saying this, it delayed things. I think the international community has tried to be more creative. In some sense, we've been told by some analysts that virtual settings help actually women to participate more. It has more women participating than if it was in presential. But at the same time, you still have some communities excluded because they don't have yet, access. So the role of digitization is still, really at stakes here. With the vaccine, it will, again, this is an issue of equity because the vaccine is not going to reach and be scaled, at the same pace for all countries. So even, by the middle of next year, it's not clear whether there's going to be our preparatory negotiations in June next year. We may not be able to travel. So are we going to continue still, to have some opportunity to talk together, to address, to think through some of the solution virtually? So I just wanted to highlight, that dimension, to try to make progress and to give the signal so that has been affected. But we may be, experiencing a revolution also on how we're going to approach and prepare and make progress in the future. And WRI is working on this. How also we manage to make sure that the process is transparent enough and that everybody access. And I see that, Michael is going to chip in on this, and this is great. So that's just on the negotiation. And of course, COVID, it's been the priority and the focus of so many countries, even, for the green recovery. I think Jake mentioned this, how it impacted, the way countries were thinking about building back better. And there's been mixed signals. Some countries are not building in the greener way necessarily and tend to reproduce some of the same mistakes and bailing out the same type of, polluters, and instead of, using this to leapfrogging into, different direction. So our ability to influence, those stimulus package, remains really important. And the fact that, at the highest diplomatic level, we see climate as still one of the greatest threats, to humanity, and tackling this will have the benefits, the win-win benefits, and help, address and leapfrog in terms of health, in terms of, and meet all the societal and economical gains. But, Jake, we can go to Michael.
We have a stack. So Jake, if you want to respond at all, then I have Albert and then I have Michael.
Okay.
I'll just be really quick because I know there's a couple others. I mean, we're, unfortunately, a bunch of countries are going to be claiming that they don't have money for the climate because of the COVID sort of piece. Obviously, that's both true and not true at the same time. So we're going to have to be making the case that, continued investments are important to build back better. What kind of response is important? But, obviously, you're going to see some countries kind of claim that they don't have money to support the international assistance at the level that we need, because we need not just the current amount, but a significant increase in that amount. The second piece, and I think it's somewhat been rectified, but I think there's a risk that world leaders only have so much bandwidth, and clearly, for at least the next year, the COVID economic situation is still going to be lingering. Even if a vaccine comes, it's not going to come everywhere, and it's not going to be happening. So a bunch of countries are going to still be grappling with that, which is obviously just a challenge for political tension. I will say it's helpful that every single call of congratulation the world leaders have said to Biden, the readout from the Biden administration reinforces that climate is a part of is a top tier of the agenda. So that's obviously really important to make sure that it's both on the U.S. international agenda, but it's also obviously on the agenda of other countries, because those are sort of important kind of stage setters for what countries see as the priority of the incoming president.
Tina, can I just
Yep, go ahead, Alberto, and then Michael, you're up.
No, I'm saying, Tina, it was my question. Can I just say something else to that?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, Michael, I didn't recognize your voice.
That's all right. It's okay. It's okay.
The little yellow box that pops up.
I know.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I asked that question because I just know that COVID-19 has pulled the scab back on inequity in terms of access to health and access to care, and I'm sure access to the virus or to the vaccine, not to the virus, because people of color are adversely are affected much more seriously than other people who are not of color, and in poor communities we were really hit hard. But that's going to be the same situation, it seems, that now with the Paris Agreement. I mean, if we can't use this as an opportunity to show really more pointedly as to why there needs to be equity, and there needs to be real attention to the underserved and overburdened. I think that even though it's a terrible situation we're in, we have to use this as a true example of why this is so important, not just the vaccine, but the agreement to be stronger than it ever was before. And thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, it has reminded people about how something that happens somewhere else can also impact everybody else, right? So this thing that started in China has now shaped the global world. It's like climate change, right? This thing that happens and whatever impacts polar bears now, impacts your kind of daily life, but it also, I think is a stark reminder of the inequities that exist. And, obviously climate change is very similar, right? In that the lowest, folks that are kind of disenfranchised, lowest economic situation tend to be, will be impacted the worst. And that's, obviously true. And, for something like COVID, and, for politicians, seeing sometimes is better than actually reading a report. And unfortunately, COVID has been the seeing for that kind of stuff. So.
Great. Alberto, you're up.
Yes, good morning, I guess, everybody. My name is Alberto Saldamando. I work with the Indigenous Environmental Network, and I've been doing climate change work for them since 2008, 2010, Copenhagen. And I've been, it's unfortunate that I would have liked to have made a better presentation on behalf of Indigenous peoples, because we have been internationally a very active interest group within the climate change negotiations. But I also would like to address these questions about COVID. We don't take the position. I mean, we take the position that the climate change agreements, both the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol, were intended to reduce emissions, and that's where we start. We need to reduce emissions. So and that's going to solve or help us mitigate the climate damage that is being done by climate events. We have gone beyond the point of no return. Climate events will be severe. They will be even more frequently, and everyone will suffer from that, the rich as well as the poor. Although the rich will afford air conditioning, but it's going to affect them. The fires affect rich people. The floods affect rich people. New York is going to be underwater, and so will Miami. So we need to reduce emissions. I think what the COVID epidemic has created is a new world. Actually, emissions have been reduced by about 8 or 9% since the start of the pandemic. And so we see that as a trend in regenerating economies. I think the Biden administration has gone this way, is to start a just transition toward a renewable energy economy, investing in alternative energy and battery, in the whole kinds of things that can in fact begin to reduce our emissions. I think one of the things that we're asking the Biden administration to do is to stop their subsidies of oil companies and to stop financing or allowing an expansion of oil and exploration. I think our pipelines have been, in fact, we're going to be putting out a report as to how the pipeline protests have actually been reducing carbon in the atmosphere. But I'd also like to talk a little bit about Article 6 or the fair share question. The fair share question is an interesting one because how do you quantify fair share? How do you quantify the emissions? And I think that that's really a problem of calling for a fair share doesn't really quantify what the United States and developed countries have to do to reduce their carbon emissions. We look at it as a matter, as a quantification matter of reductions from 1990 levels, which was the start of the Paris of the Framework Convention. We believe, for example, that the United States should reduce their emissions in 2030 by 70% of their 1990 emissions. Because what they have now with the nationally determined contributions is only 50% of what would be required to keep us under 2 degrees. So they have to double their commitment. All of the states, including China, have to double their commitments in order to try to begin to address the damage caused by climate change. And I think if you allow me a little bit of time with regard to indigenous peoples, we see us as the canaries in the coal mine. We're the ones that are suffering most directly and most severely from climate change without, and the solutions that they're proposing, like REDS, has actually not improved our position at all, but in fact been detrimental because the states do not want to recognize indigenous peoples and their rights, because then it would be indigenous peoples that are owners of the land. So right now you have a situation where like Brazil, Colombia, they're declaring, instead of entitling or titling indigenous lands, they're declaring national parks. They're declaring conservation areas where they can go ahead and actually develop. So we're hit not only by the whammy of climate change, but the false solutions. I mean, in terms of environmental justice, and that's really the position we're coming at, like in that like say the refinery aspect of environmental justice, what would help communities avoid that would be a reduction of oil processing, a reduction of processing and refining oil. That would reduce the flaring. If in fact the United States de-emphasized carbon fossil fuel expansion, it would really help communities reduce the health effects of these really terrible results of oil production. It's not just refineries though; it's also the oil fields like tar sands. It's the most poisonous environment known to man, and they're mining sand in Canada in an area the size of Florida. It's a big mud puddle, black mud puddle in Florida. So it's not just, it's fracking causing earthquakes, causing cancer clusters. I mean, those are the evil results of carbon production. And from an environmental justice perspective, the more you reduce oil production and oil use, the more you reduce those damaging effects on the health of people of color and poor people in areas of carbon processing or carbon fossil fuel processing. I think there's other aspects I'd like to talk about, but I know there's time. Really, the detailed analyses provided by the other two speakers, I think, is really a lot of information that we have to process as civil society. But I think the major point would be that because we take a human rights perspective, and because human rights are not observed, and they're given lip service, and actually, when you take a look at the political nature of climate change within the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and now the Paris Agreement, it really demonstrates the total inability of the international community to deal with an international problem. And that's just not goes to climate change. it goes to the COVID pandemic. There has been no solidarity shown by the rich countries toward the poor. I mean, they have shortages of masks, for crying out loud. In Guatemala, we've been trying to get masks to Guatemala, to indigenous peoples there. I mean, in Latin America, tourists have brought the COVID pandemic down to indigenous peoples that use tourism as a resource, they're just
Alberto,
incapable of dealing with these problems. And we just see us as civil society outside of the process, banging on the door, going after the banks, and really trying to get it done when they are incapable of doing it themselves. So thank you. I'm sorry it took so long.
yeah, no, you're fine. I sorry, I thought you were wrapping up before I interjected, so I apologize. But I wanted just to just take a few minutes with this, because this is Q&A and discussion. So this is not just ask questions of the panelists, but also for the panelists to be part of a discussion. And I think that's what from the question, right? It's sort of, and I know, knowing the work that you two do, Jake and Yamid, that you know this, you get this, you understand this, and that your work is really around how do you create more fairness, more equity, more opportunities in your roles. But it is that question around, again, how do you, for lack of a better word, I've never been married, so I'm going to use it. How do you marry together this need to do that, like reduce carbon emissions? Yes, we need to do that, but the question's always the how. And so there is sort of the modeling that's been done that says, you know, we can't just get off of fossil fuels like that, because there's not enough renewable energy available to create a sustainable energy market that will supply the needs of the folks that currently have access and into the future. And yet you're hearing this very clear example of the disconnect between the impacts. And so in this international fora where these conversations take place in a more of a bubble, where civil society can influence from the outside, but not always level up to the place of having real impact on that influence. Where is the opportunity? Now we're in COVID times. Now we have time. We're in a government with a Biden administration that wants to do Build Back Better. EJ is the cornerstone of that plan. I mean, where are the opportunities for us to push? Is where I would ask you to sort of react to. And then, Michael, I have not forgotten you. I mean, yeah, Michael, I haven't forgotten you.
Don't worry about me. We're good. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, those are, I mean, I think those are all the right, you know, the right questions. I mean, I think it is going to take, I think there's going to be more resonance than there was in the Obama administration, you know. So, you know, I'll give you a couple examples. My organization, we actually got into the Keystone XL fight way upstream because we were working with a number of folks in in Canada to protect forest in that part of Canada, and then having conversations with the Indigenous communities and First Nation folks there, and realizing that this thing was destroying everything and also causing huge toxic ponds, and the cancer rates were astronomically high kind of downstream and sort of that. So we tried to kind of elevate their voices and bring that to the forefront. And at the end, the climate decision, the Keystone XL became a climate decision. I think that's probably, if you were to have that same fight now, I suspect that the kind of frontline communities impacts would gain more traction in pushing back on that formulation. So I think that's going to be important for us to be making that case kind of front and center. And then I think that the second piece is as Tina mentioned, those climate models. I mean, I've done modeling. There's a bunch of assumptions in there. Everybody will tell you can't get to 100% of something. But the reality on the ground is, we have the technology, we have the solutions today. It's a matter of, can we push the politics and the social acceptance of these things fast enough to be able to drive these pieces? And I do think that having, you know, kind of a justice frame to that is going to be more important, because as I sort of, as I said, you know, like, you know, we can actually be making the case now, which is we can address some of these other issues, and simultaneously solve the climate crisis. So that the climate crisis is the co-benefits of that. So we need to make sure that the solutions that we're bringing forward, you know, are oriented to that, and we're elevating the voices and driving policy and aspects that, you know, make people's communities better, right? It's just a nicer place to live because you don't have a coal plant right next to you. You happen to have solar panels on everybody's house, or, you know, you don't have to worry about heating, you know, paying, you know, exorbitant amount of money for your heating and air conditioning because your building's just built better, you know, has energy efficient windows. Your air conditioner doesn't, you know, require you to spend, you know, twice your monthly income on, you know, just heating cost or cooling costs. And then I think, you know, the third place that I'll, you know, flag, you know, I think there's a bit of a growing conversation I think is really important, which is, you know, as the nature-based solutions kind of frame gains traction, you know, there's tons of evidence about, you know, how indigenous community-led protection of forests and development of land is the best, you know, is impactful, best solutions. You know, so for example, you know, we work with a number of, you know, First Nations and indigenous communities in Canada to kind of protect the Canadian boreal. That's true. Obviously, if you know, tons of study have been done on the Brazilian Amazon of how the, you know, the indigenous communities there have, you know, the better protection of the land, and there's a growing conversation around how indigenous led protection is kind of has to be the center of a nature-based solution, in particular for the forest agenda. And I think that's a piece that will be really important to continue, you know, to drive, you know, kind of forward. Probably lots more, but it's good. It's a good set of things. Those are the ones off the top of my head, but
Yes, and you know, well, first of all, thanks, Alberto. I like like Jake, we agree. I mean, there's a form of hypocrisy. I think, you know, Malcolm is putting this in his comments. You know, we can mobilize. The word has embarked into some radical kind of change and decisions in a case of emergency like COVID. So, you know, and we haven't seen those type of radical shift, you know, for climate change. So when we want, we can. And you know, the link with the lessons from COVID needs to be very much harnessed. And we have organized a number of convenings, and the word, you know, radical collaboration came in. You know, to definitely the other thing that, you know, came in when talking about radical collaboration is, you know, would it change if instead of UNFCCC you had UNFCCC, like, you know, climate change risk, because everybody now could appreciate the risk and really frame it around that climate emergency a little bit more. You know, would there be a win-win, instead of, you know, that zero-sum game that, you know, we see into the negotiations, unfortunately. And the sentiment that unless it's really happening in their backyard, developed countries tend not to really worry. And, you know, with the vulnerable world, or, you know, do not do what it takes. And we see the same, you know, in country. But on the bright side, you know, there's, you know, things that are happening in, I believe that some of the solutions and a lot of the things that can be done, and especially by, you know, indigenous, with the indigenous knowledge, but also harnessing, you know, the technology. Um, there's a lot to do with indigenous knowledge, and one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that some of the vulnerable voices have the means to also bring their own studies and to see those alternative, you know, transitional pathways than, you know, the one that would require systematically, you know, those CCS, those, you know, direct removal, or some of, you know, the more polemical, suggestions, because we need to see also where those, some of those studies are emerging. And I am, coming from, where I am, you know, I am aware of those tensions, also coming from a big institutions like the PRI. So I am, talking also in my own capacity, but, our ability, even for big companies to make sure that there's a more radical kind of efforts to engage with more radical voices so that, alternative solutions are also highlighted, is important. And I'm saying that because I was yesterday with one of the best scientists, in Africa, and he was describing to some funders, hey, look at, the revolution that we've seen on mobile phone. 15 years ago, would you have imagined, Africa, the way they are embracing, telecommunication and mobile phones? We can do the same, on renewable energy. Now, what would prevent, some countries to go there? What would it take, to do that? So, what he's trying to do is to get enough funding to bring all the best scientists from the diaspora, not even, just, African, to try to look at really what an African transition, energy transition could look like, on with renewable. And if you have to use gases, can you make sure that it has, first of all, you really cannot do otherwise, and that it is transient. It's not going to be forever, and that the infrastructure can switch to, the path that we know is not going to lead to stranded asset. So there's a lot of sometimes, thinking and a lot of creative, innovative thinking, but the providing the means, for that innovative thinking to also come through and to be out and to be vocal loud enough is we need to do more to make this happen too.
Great. Michael, if you're still
well,
on,
could I try to respond to your
me,
question?
can you,
Okay.
1 second, just because Alberto's, because we're 9 minutes away. I want to get
Okay.
Michael's question in, just to be respectful of that stack, and then we'll try to give you another go. Okay, Michael, go ahead.
Tina, I said that was okay. I'm good. Thank you, though.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Alberto. Thanks, Michael.
No, I think yeah, thank you, Michael. I think the question, as I understood it, was, okay, what can we do inside? What can we do inside the process? If I understood the question correctly, there is an opportunity, at least, to inject equity and justice within the process. We have a very strong push, and I think the women and gender, the youth, indigenous peoples, about 4 or 5 of the major, even I think CAN to a certain degree, would support very much an imposition of human rights standards for climate solutions that would in fact reduce their dependency on fossil fuels. For example, we're suggesting, and I think it's going to be at issue, that they impose human rights solutions, human rights-based criteria with regard to the offsets that they will be applying to their nationally determined contributions. So that if an offset or a credit is generated in whole or in part by a violation of human rights or the rights of indigenous peoples, that it not be allowed to be count against their emissions. So that would reduce their dependency on non-carbon emissions NDCs, because what Article 6 does, it sets up a market where they can start trading carbon credits that have never worked to reduce emissions, and allow them to continue business as usual, producing and processing petroleum products and fossil fuel energy. So I think from our perspective, we have to get them to reduce that dependency. And I also believe that the COVID pandemic has created an economic conditions whereby renewing economies through not renewable resources is viable. And I think, in fact, the Biden administration has at least expressed that intent to start investing in alternative energy and reduce the country's dependence on fossil fuels. So internally, I think we can all work toward an imposition of human rights and standards with regard to the NDCs that would really, I think, help a great deal in enforcing them to reduce emissions.
Thanks, Albert. Alberto, I appreciate that. That's actually a really good perspective and some really good insight for us to consider. I want to ask if anyone else has any questions before we move into our wrap up. Hearing none. I want to first again thank Yamid and Jake for being on this call, on this webinar, and actually sharing this insight and being very open and I think just clear on opportunities as well as challenges. I don't think this will be our last conversation with you all. Also, Yamid is a member of the NBEJN network. So she's stuck for at least for a year or longer. But there is lots of work for us to be considering on both fronts, from the international perspective, as was laid out by Yamid, but also from the domestic US international approach that was laid out by Jake, which Jake and I've talked about. This definitely needs more equity and justice as a lens. So we need to review that. And I appreciate you sharing it with us and acknowledging that point. So I just want to say, I really appreciated this conversation, this information. And I want to give Yamid and Jake just the last word on their end before we go.
It's a thank you. I mean, we made it so far, but thank you. This space is very important. I just feel like, you know, some of those ideas that we heard, including from Alberto, it's about having having those ideas coming also from those organizations or those influencers that do not necessarily say that, you know. So it's how to amplify, because, you know, on market, I totally agree. We need to, for example, push for, you know, social safeguards and human rights. This is not an angle that some of the big influencing organizations or, you know, are necessarily putting front and center. So it's how to amplify. I think we need to think how to amplify, how to be more nimble in in using the right narrative, the compelling narrative, and to think about those radical collaboration, you know, to change the statu quo.
Yeah, well, I'll just end with a huge thanks to Tina, but also to you all. You know, keep keep the lines of communication open, keep the door open. You know, I think happy to continue the conversation. You know, I will say, you know, I think we, and I like to say the collective people that care for climate solutions, are going to have to push. We're going to, you know, we've lost 30 years, and we lost the last 4 years. And that means that the sprint began yesterday, you know, January 21st. You know, the Biden team is going to have to be, you know, coming out and sprinting, but they're also going to have to sprint for a marathon. And they're also going to have to be pushed, and you know, it's going to be our collective job to kind of push them to be bolder, faster, more aggressive, more creative on driving, you know, an aggressive, you know, domestic and international climate agenda. And so I think it's really important that we kind of continue the conversation and see how we can all collectively be doing that, because you know, unfortunately, we don't have any time to waste. We need, you know, we have a day one agenda that really is a, you know, a 30-year agenda that has to be delivered on day one, and then they need to move on to the next thing. So it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to get our to, you know, take the last whatever couple days of the new year, unwind a little bit in whatever COVID way that we're unwinding, and then be prepared for the battle of the century, the fight, and all the energy that we have, because unfortunately the clock is ticking on us, and we don't have the luxury of a bit more time.
Great, thank you. Just so everyone knows, this was great, and we have another webinar on Thursday. It's Utilities 101, and we're looking at utilities from an industry's perspective, the opportunities and challenges for environmental justice. It's going to be from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern, and there's a registration link that you all should have received. If not, you can ping myself or you can ping Karine. Thank you all so very much. We are just, I don't know, I feel smarter all the time. So when I hear so many wonderful insights and perspectives for me to consider as far as information I'm getting. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. I appreciate you too. And I appreciate the people on the call. So everyone, have a good afternoon. Have good holidays. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
You.